Okay, thank you, Dr. Safford. Dr. Tarnay.
All right, I'll try not to blow your ears out or hold it too close or too far. Let me know if I'm too far away or too close. So I am now working for the Forest Service. I'm a newly minted member of the Forest Service. I was working for Yosemite National Park for about 10 years. And part of the reason that I'm here is the unprecedented scale of both the fires and of their impacts on air quality from those fires. And so now I'm working with the Pacific Southwest Research Station as well, and focusing on the science of how to understand the consequences of air quality for landscape management and the consequences of the other way around too. So one reason I put the Earth up there is because I think one of the things that just happened in the last couple of years is that we now can see the footprint of these fires from space. It was kind of a remarkable thing. When you look at MODIS and satellite imagery, you can now see the footprint of the rim fire, clear as day. And I'm here to talk about what those consequences are in terms of air quality and in terms of carbon from these past couple megafires, and give you some perspective on how we might, the nuts and bolts of how we might start to address those risks going forward in the future. So first I'll talk about the impact on air quality, the impact on carbon, some of the strategies that we've learned in places like Yosemite, where how to start back in landscapes and rebuild mosaics, and talk about maybe ways of prioritizing over these landscapes in terms of getting those larger scale fires to actually happen, given all the regulatory constraints on smoke and air quality. So here's a picture of the last 2 years, basically. This is from space. Well, it's sort of from space. It's Google, but if you, it's Google space. Yeah. So it's Google's representation of the Earth from space, right? So we have, remember when 22,000 acres was a really big fire? And that speaks to, Hugh really introduced that concept well. We're really seeing unprecedented scales in terms of just acreage from all the fires. We had the 22,000, these were and 13,000, those are the small fires. And then we've got King Fire, 98,000, 255,000. Those are really large fires, and they had really large impacts regionally for air quality, impacts that drew me out of Yosemite National Park and made it so that a detail working across agencies was really the only way that made sense to help start addressing the smoke impacts. And so these graphs right here, you don't need to see them very closely, but this is Grass Valley, this is Reno, this is Truckee, this is Yosemite. All of these, the signatures from these big megafires are very, very clear across all these areas. These big fires had regional impacts. And so the y-axis here is the PM 2.5 concentration, and these are the years down at the bottom there. So as you can see, here we start at about 2009. That's as far back as I could grab all the data really quickly. They're unprecedented. 2008 might have looked a lot like this, with some spikes into what is basically the hazardous zone of the air quality index. So these color backgrounds give you an idea of the relative health impacts of these smoke events. But these were huge smoke events that affected the entire state and other states. So we've got Reno on this because we basically, that smoke went to Nevada and even Idaho, really, if you look at some of these impacts. And so there's a different. The reason that it's important to think across agencies is because this smoke is not stopping, even at local. Sometimes it would cross into Forest Service land or into other air districts before this, but now we're talking about fires that are crossing state boundaries, going from Northern California to Southern California and vice versa. So there's a need to really look at this entire the Sierra Nevada ecosystem as a whole and start to address it across agencies. I've also, from my work in Yosemite, we also did some calculation based on the fire progression to look at basically daily emissions from the rimfire. And emissions not only in terms of PM10, which is basically the basis for smoke, but also in terms of carbon, in terms of CO2. And what you get there is a pretty fantastical scale. So here's the PM10 in tons per day, and then here is CO2 in tons of CO2 per day. And what's amazing is that when we did prescribed fires in Yosemite, the rule of thumb was maybe 30 tons a day of PM10 would be something above which we worried about maybe regional impacts. This scale is 2,000 to 14,000 tons of PM10 per day. These are gargantuan amounts compared to what we see in terms of prescribed or even managed wildfires that went up to 6,000 or 7,000 acres on a daily basis. This thing put so much smoke into the air that it was a planetary event, and you could definitely see that from space. If I backed off to that global picture, I bet you could have seen the rimfire plume. In terms of greenhouse gases and CO2, and I'm not even talking about CO2 equivalent, because you add methane and you add nitrous oxide or nitrogen dioxide to that, and you get a little bit more greenhouse gas effect. But just the CO2 coming off that fire on about 4 or 5 days, just that CO2 coming off the fire was enough, was way more than the annual emissions of Yosemite National Park. We're really talking about, in terms of scale, we're talking about the emissions of large cities like San Francisco on a daily basis coming off this fire. So these are very, very large numbers. And we've figured out these life cycle impacts or annual inventories based on, Yosemite National Park is a place where millions of people come to visit every year, 4 million people a year, many, many, many cars. These annual emissions estimates include all those cars driving. So when you compare the impact of cars driving to the impact of fires and their emissions, these are very, very large numbers. Fire severity across the rimfire was obviously extremely high, and this is a map of that severity. So one thing that I wanted to point out, though, is that you don't stop at emissions when you think about the impacts of a fire, especially a high severity fire, on carbon, and because of the effect on the carbon stock. And this is a picture looking sort of northwest from the Rim of the World pullout, which is basically what the rimfire was named after. And as you can see, as far as the eye can see, you see dead things. You see brown. There's nothing alive there. And when you kill the trees, that carbon in those trees becomes will be released to the atmosphere at one point or another, or at least a large fraction of it will. Maybe 20% can be retained in the soil if it's something that's in a system that's recycling all that stuff. But in this case, who knows what's going to happen in the future with the warmer temperatures. So we did some recent work with just the amount of carbon in the footprint of the rimfire that was in Yosemite. So 78,000 out of 255,000 acres. And we we basically, initially, when you start before a fire, you have some live trees and you have some dead trees, mostly live, lots of live, maybe too many live, right? We picked some reasonable values for what would happen at the different fire severities, and then we calculated what percent would go into the dead pool, what percent would go into the live pool, and then what percent would be lost based on those different fire severities in this different scheme here. And then we did the math across the landscape. So basically, how much, when you burn at the different severities across this map within the Yosemite footprint, what would change in terms of what's been lost to the atmosphere in terms of emissions, what actually just died and will be lost to the atmosphere at some point, and then what stays alive. And the numbers are fairly were kind of surprising to me. Basically, because we killed so many fires in this high severity event, or killed so many trees in the high severity event, we basically the amount of post-fire dead that changed from live to dead is several times higher than the amount emitted to the atmosphere. So those gargantuan daily emissions that we saw in terms of let's go back a couple. So these emissions are actually relatively small compared to what was killed in the fire And I think that's an important point to make too, that the emissions aren't done yet from the rim fire or from the King fire and these high severity events, is that we are going to see more emissions coming off these places. And that's basically because when a fire burns, it's not really burning everything in the forest. It's burning the small stuff, the stuff that's actually doesn't have a lot of volume to it, the stuff that the fire can reach. And the rest of it is, what really matters in terms of the long-term emissions from a fire is whether or not the biomass gets killed. And these high severity fires are killing a lot more trees than the normal fire with its regular distributions of high and moderate and low severity would normally generate. And so that's a real concern with these bigger high severity fires. And then there's opportunity cost, right? So all of these trees are solar panels, right? Well, and not really solar panels. They're not just solar panels. They're gaining energy by laying it into biomass, and they are laying down biomass every year. And when you kill all those solar panels that are laying down biomass, then you are foregoing a lot of sequestration as well. So it's that delta between what would have been sequestered by this healthy forest and what is now actually a net source of carbon is also important to consider in the long term. So this is the reason, from a carbon perspective, we're also concerned about fire and high severity fire in particular. Just to move towards sort of the future scenarios like Hugh was talking about, there's a lot of different models out there, and they've actually calculated probabilistically over the next 100 years what would happen, with the different climate scenarios, the low emission scenario and the high emission scenario, and looked at what that would mean for the amount of fine particles generated by fire going forward. And so here is the amount of smoke generated right now. Here's the amount of smoke generated in the next, say, 2035 to 64, right here. And then here's the amount of smoke generated, 70 to 99. So we're basically effectively going to increase, by at least 50% over the next 50 to 100 years, the amount of emissions going into the air. And that means air pollution, right? That means a lot of more smoke going into the air. And when is that smoke going to go in the air? It's not going to go into the air in January. It's going to go into the air in the summer when it's hot and dry, right? And so that's where severity and moderating severity might have can make a difference, because they also looked at how moderating severity might change the emissions. And in some scenarios, if you burn everything at low severity, you get these emissions. If you burn everything in high severity, you get these emissions. So severity does matter, and lots more consumes and goes into the air at high severity. For low, mid, and high severity, things get higher with things. We get more emissions going forward when it gets warmer, basically. And at the end of it all, in 100 years, we get a lot more. But as you can see, you can definitely change the amount that goes up in the air if you burn at the lower versus the higher severities. So that is something that is one of the strategies that we might use to prevent the air quality impacts over the long term and preserve some of our air quality into the future. But the other message here is that we are going to see more smoke in the future, and it will be smokier in California in the future. And so not only are we going to have a different Sierra Nevada than we see now, we're going to have a lot more trouble seeing it sometimes because of the smoke and the air quality. Here is a graph of basically the dispersion over the course of the fire season, basically from May through the end of October. And this is the percentage of no burn and sort of marginal burn days in this. This is South Mountains County near Yosemite, where I have most of my experience. And this is just a reminder that basically most of the fires occur this time of the year, where the dispersion is the worst. And so what if we were to implement policies that change the severity fires, we'd probably end up doing a lot of prescribed and managed fires. And those fires occur in these times of year, when there's less, when it's cooler, when it's not as dry, and there's also better dispersion in those times of year. So if we want to, one of the things that tackling and moderating severity might do, might also lessen the impacts of our projects because we're in better dispersion. So matching emissions to dispersion is another strategy for mitigating and for allowing those larger projects, those larger scale projects to happen, because we're not going to be able to, we're going to have a lot of impacts if we burn at those scales in the summers. And better dispersion will help mitigate those impacts. Title 17, which is the law that governs smoke management in California, talks about minimizing impacts. It doesn't talk about preventing impacts. And I think that's one of the things that we need to focus on from a nuts and bolts perspective. You know, how do we get these big projects done? Well, we're going to have to figure out a way of doing the best we can and recognize that it's going to get smokier one way or the other. And then the other thing we probably at least want to start thinking about is really thinking about anchor points on the landscape. Where are these first big projects going to happen? For a decade or more, Yosemite was working on all of these different blue area projects. These are previous fire footprints. Some of those were prescribed fires. Some of those were managed wildfires. Those fires helped on the landscape, and they provided an anchor point for the management for the backfires that were done in response to the rim fire, during the rim fire. And so not only was the footprint of those, did the fire change its behavior in the footprint of those treatments, but they were also able to use those footprints to help attack the fire. And so that there's sort of a multiplier effect there. And thinking going forward, there are places on that landscape where we haven't drawn the curtain across the next drainage, basically the South Fork of the Merced here. There are gaps there where fires could come up from low elevation to high elevation, and those gaps are the places where I would think we'd want to target such large projects. And so, and we'd want to do that not in the middle of the summer, but in places in the times of the summer or the times of the spring or fall when we have the better dispersion. And so we can warn people about that smoke too. So instead of the Ironman, millions of dollars, millions and thousands of people coming from around the world to go to Tahoe and then finding themselves in 200 microgram per meter cubed plus very unhealthy conditions, we can warn people about this, and maybe they can schedule around that stuff. So not that prescribed fire is going to prevent all impacts. You can't stop fires during some extreme fire behavior days. Sometimes it's just so hot and dry and there's so much fuel that you can't do anything. But when those days go away, when the next cool day, then you've got a shot at attacking those fires. And these anchor points and treatments will be the places where that can happen for the fire managers. Here's another place where they're trying to sort of treat a drainage. The Boulder Creek burn is in the Sequoia National Forest. It's tearing off the 2010 sheep fire, which was 8,700 acres. That used to be sort of a big fire. And they actually proposed 3,200 acres. It was approved by San Joaquin Air District, and we were going to go forward with it. But the government shut down the first time. Resources weren't available the second time. So there's a lot of moving parts that have to occur at the same time to manage smoke and to treat these areas so that we preserve the carbon in the forests in them as well. And so, the rest of that thing is, the rest of that unit is another 14,000 acres. And, if we protect that part, there's a good chance that fires will have a harder time growing into the rest of the 97,000 acres that are in that drainage that are green, basically. Here's an example of this is the Illilouette Basin. It's sort of the classic example of fire mosaics, but this is where we want to go, right? We want to have treatments that overlap. We want to have different levels of fuels going all across the landscape and different fire behaviors and places where we can stop the fire if we want to or let the fire go if it's doing good things and treating the landscape and preserving that carbon. So conclusions, protecting carbon stocks and air quality actually means a larger scale of wildfire. These 50-acre treatments on these landscape don't create landscape level fire mosaics. If there's a word for the day, it's scale, right? And severity does matter. If we can lower the emissions on a per acre basis, we can also prevent loss of carbon in the long term, at least the medium to long term. Who knows where forests are going to go, but I think we have a lot better chance of preserving the big trees if we have moderated severity and treated the landscape beforehand. And the mosaics and creating these mosaics is the point here. So, and really, we pretty much know that every patch of forest in Sierra Nevada is going to burn, and we want to pick how it's going to burn and when it's going to burn if we can. And smoke management is a key part of the beginning of that, and then the mosaics created by those projects, started by those projects, are where we want to go. So, I guess that's it. I think I hit the button too soon, but oh well.